Hello, FewCandy here, and welcome back to part 2 of our Cities Skylines II Early Access First Look City Building Experience. So last time we did get up to milestone 4 and had a look at what the game offers within those first 4 milestones. This time we're going to be progressing from milestone 4 through to milestone 8, but there are a couple of very exciting additions that I do want to show you before we actually jump in. So there's been a few updates to the game already. And the main one of those is contour lines. Yes, we have got them now, so you can see them here. They are a little bit fainter than they were in Cities 1, but Colossal Order have listened and they have added them. What absolute fantastic news! And I think that really gives us a lot of hope for what else they can add into this game as time goes on. I'm just going to hint at some props, please. And not only did we get that on the landscaping panel, there is also now a toggle on any networks as well, so roads and rail and the such like. So you can see them as you're building a road, or you can choose to turn them off, obviously, if you want to. So much easier now to follow the topography and use that wisely. Like as we have done here, I didn't want to build a completely flat city, so a lot of this is just trying to follow the terrain, but I was doing it blind without contour lines, which made it quite difficult. The other update I do want to mention as well is to do with trees. So before, when we placed a tree, if we tried to place one that was overlapping, it would delete the previous tree that we put in. Incredibly annoying, especially if you're trying to do those kind of intricate bush patterns along different roads to create a hedge, which is in itself incredibly time consuming and not very exciting with that prop line tool. But now that doesn't happen, so you can't actually place one that's overlapping another tree. So this is a massive improvement, honestly, to the game. Like, really loving, actually, that they've incorporated that as well and listened on that respect. And one other thing I did want to mention before we crack on is the power lines as well. I didn't show you this in the first episode, but you can actually place power lines underground. So if you wanted to hide these massive power lines from being visible above ground, you can just click page down when you're on them and put them underground so you can't even see them, which is exactly what I've done here with the local lines between our different wind turbines. So yeah, that is an incredibly nice feature as well, and one that I failed to point out in the first video, so I wanted to mention that to you now. In addition to our stone quarry as well, so we've got this. The stone texture actually is really quite detailed and quite nice. I quite enjoy this. I'm pleased with that texture. It's better than the grass or the fields actually. And I think with these, you can come up with some quite nice patterns carving it into the landscape with the cliff texture around it. Maybe a bit better than I've done very roughly here. And if you have a large enough space for your stone quarry as well, you will get one of those giant toothpick assets appearing in it, so much like our livestock farms. There's a few random assets that will appear within the stone area if you do it large enough. Obviously mine isn't here, but it can look a little bit odd, and one wish list I really have is that we can have control over where those elements are placed, so we could move them around within this. Really won't move it, ultimately. But that would really help with the design purposes, particularly for those livestock farms. And speaking of which, obviously, if you've watched my first video, you'll know I have quite a few issues with these. There's no road connections to our big farm buildings. The actual field themselves look like crops, not pasture, so all in all, it's pretty random. But if you create lots of smaller farms like this, I find it actually looks a little bit nicer and a little bit more tolerable than what we had previously. You can see the tractors just driving across the crops is what it looks like here. I really hope that they change up this texture so that it's pasture for the livestock farms at least. But one other thing to point out as well is the actual buildings from our livestock farms. You can see here, they're all different. So in actual fact, these two are the same assets, but they've got different skins on the buildings. So like this one's a white here, where that's like a kind of tan wood colour. And that is one really awesome feature of Cities 2 that I did want to point out there, is the different building skins. So it makes these two look different and pretty unique. And when we come to the issue of repeated assets like we have here, actually if we look at them, all of the walls are slightly different, so they do look different. The roofs are slightly different, the props around them differ as well, so that does give them some individual personality. And I really, really like that they've done that, and it's not just, you know, one asset, same props, the same colour walls, etc. So you've got these various skins now that can be applied to assets, so great improvement from CS1 there. So at milestone 4, we did also unlock grain farming and forestry, and also the ability to finally see our production tab as well. Now this is really interesting, and this is where the game kind of gets interesting for those management sim fans, I would say, where you can see in detail what products you are making here. So obviously we've got livestock farms and a stone quarry in, how much surplus we have, so how much extra we're making that I'm assuming we're exporting at this point via road, and also a deficit. So for things like forestry, we haven't got forestry and we've got a deficit of that. We haven't actually unlocked the ability to have vegetable farms yet, but we've also got a deficit in that. So at the moment, we'll be importing any vegetables needed for our industrial assets. So we click on these as well, you can see here. So this actually is creating food and it needs vegetables and livestock for that. So obviously the livestock, I'm assuming it's going to be taking it from our farms, but the vegetables will be imported at the moment. And it's the same for all of these. So you can see what they need and what they are producing here. Obviously, you don't have control over what actually spawns in, which is the interesting thing, because if we go back to our production tab here, you can see for grain, we're not actually making anything that requires grain at the moment, which is super odd. But we go to material goods down here, petrochemicals. So we have a huge deficit on that. We haven't got any industry actually making this or importing anything for it. Petrochemicals is used for quite a few things, so there's a large deficit here. But it's super odd that we don't have any industry actually producing that. So I'm kind of a bit flummoxed as to how this all works and how it decides what industry buildings are actually going to spawn in here. It's a mechanic I haven't quite got my head around yet, but it's an interesting one indeed. But obviously there is a need for petrochemicals because we've got this huge deficit. So we want to make sure that we're getting grain and oil in there in order to produce it. And you can see here like what we're actually making. So in terms of food, we're making food, but we've got a huge deficit. So we obviously need more industry, which is showing through our demand here, and have some more food assets spawn in. And I suppose you could have a bit of control over it by deleting out things. So if you know you've got an excess of beverages, for example, and a beverages factory spawns in, you could delete it out and hope that something else spawns in. So maybe that is the way to control it. But it's an interesting mechanic and one I haven't fully figured out yet. Like, why are we not using grain at all? So we're going to go ahead and add grain and forestry. And so starting off with forestry industry. So you can see where the resources are, and really it is dense forest that is needed for this. Unfortunately, I don't really have any on my map, and I have placed new young trees, but they don't act very well for forestry resource. So you kind of have to wait for them to fully grow up if you want to develop your own forestry area, which takes literal in-game years, unfortunately, based on the mechanic right now. So it's a nice mechanic. It's very realistic, obviously, if you want to see a city kind of developing really from a very brand new, immature kind of place up to a very mature area. But it's incredibly frustrating for putting in forestry area where you want, unlike CS1. So again, like we've got an area of effect very similar to the livestock farms that we can place our area in, and it's very freeform. We can just choose what area we're going to make our forestry district. Very much the same. Snapping to roads is a really great function for this. And then you'll see once it's complete, the ground underneath it kind of turns brown. I'm not super in love with that. I know it's like meant to be kind of forest floor ultimately, but surely have that in every forest, not just one that is forestry industry. And then the forestry main building is literally this. It's 2 huts. And then you can occasionally see a truck kind of driving around the area. It's massively disappointing, I won't lie. Like, I think this needs developing, and I'm sure it will come with DLCs in the game to kind of flesh this mechanic out. But compared to the forestry industry that we're used to in CS1, and I know CS1 isn't a comparison, this is a brand new game, but they've had 8 years of CS1 to learn from, and you would have hoped that some of the best features of it would be incorporated into the base game, obviously with DLCs still to come. But I feel like this is a step backward for forestry ultimately. So we're going to go on to grain farms, and again they work in exactly the same way. You draw out your industry area, and the good thing with grain farms is there's no random buildings that spawn in amongst your area. So with forestry it is literally only the main building. Again, there's no random buildings in that either. It's just the area, and same with grain farm. So the grain farm looks so much more realistic than the livestock farm. Like, it is actually a grained field texture and it looks appropriate and correct. So much prefer these over the livestock farms, to be honest. So if we go back and have a little look at the production tab now that we've got that in, you can see we're making grain, but we've got an exact surplus of it. Obviously we need to place in some more industry in order to get that in. For things like the petrochemicals, yeah, we need the industrial buildings in order to satisfy that deficit which is coming from the commercial buildings. So more zoned industry needed now that we've plopped it, and hopefully we'll get some petrochemical factories which are actually going to use some of this grain, because at the moment the grain farm is completely pointless from a production point of view. However, it is making us a hell of a lot of money. So very quickly before we move on, I also want to talk about the different themes, because as well as changing your zoning to North American or European, so even though we're in a European map, we can place North American themed buildings within it. You also have different trees for each. So if we look at North American, for example, we get things like the linden and the London plane tree, which we don't get within the European tab. There is some crossover, so things like the pine and the alder, I think, are in both, but there are a couple of different trees within each theme, so it's good to explore that as well and give yourself a few more different options, because the forest brush is quite a nice tool. Actually, you can create some fairly dense forests once those trees all age up by brushing in different types of trees over the top of each other. So I tend to start with some of the larger trees and add in some smaller width trees, so things like alder to start with, some pines, for example, a little bit later on, and they slot into the gaps quite nicely between the alders. So much easier to use than it was in CS2, and even though there's not a mixed type of tree forest brush, it's definitely an advantage there. And then I very quickly want to mention garbage here, as we use the grid tool for the first time to build out a little extension to our industry area here, and we're going to pull up garbage on the end. Now the landfill is an absolutely massive asset, but the asset itself is really nice. And then the landfill works in exactly the same way as the specialised industries, where you create a zone for your landfill, so you can make this whatever shape and size that you want. Now, I didn't put garbage in the first episode because there isn't an immediate need for it, and it does cost quite a lot to run the main landfill site. But I have found as you get to bigger cities, you really do need it, and you start to get people complaining about that build up. So it is worth putting in once your budget can allow it. Now also here as well, I've noticed we've got a car crash. Now the disappointing thing with these is it's really hard to spot them. You just have to be in the right place at the right time to notice it. There's no pop-up that happens. There's nothing to warn you that there has been a crash. But clearly this guy has been involved in an incident. He's off the road. His car doesn't look particularly damaged, but he is complaining that he has crashed. So now the thing with this is they just sit there and wait for the police to come. We don't have a road maintenance at the moment, so we can't show how that works. But this car is just going to sit and wait for the police. And then as soon as the police arrive, he's just going to happily drive off on his merry way. It's a pretty fun mechanic, and you can see some cars in some pretty different interesting situations, so I really like the addition of that, although I just wish it was a lot more visible. So yeah, here comes the police car now. He's just going to stop on the side of the road, and then this guy's going to carry on, and that's it. So I just want to make a brief note on parks, because you can see with the small park here, if we place in two side by side, they actually come in very slightly different. So we've got two different gazebos on it. We've got various different props on each of them as well. So the bench layouts aren't exactly the same on each. We've got different food trucks in the front of them too. So that's a really nice aspect, similar to the building skins that I showed you earlier in the episode being slightly different. We get the same thing with parks. I just wish there was that drop down that they introduced quite late on in CS2 so that you could actually select which different style of park you wanted in there. But it's kind of more sort of, it seems a bit more procedurally generated in terms of the props that appear in each park, which I really like, and adds a bit more uniqueness to each park when you place it in. And the other thing I do want to talk about here is zoning. So I'm not going to show very much of the zoning and the kind of actual road building, road network building in this episode, because it's very much more of the same mechanics that we talked about in the first episode. But the broken zones are vastly more noticeable, I think, in CS2, just because the zoning pattern is 6 deep rather than 4, so they're much deeper zones. So you end up with much more blank space in between them when you're trying to build along an organic road layout such as this. So grids work a hell of a lot better, unfortunately, in CS2. I'm not a massive lover of just boring straight grids, but they do look so much better in this game than trying to go organic, particularly because of the lack of props and the detailing aspects like fences and things like that we can't add in to kind of shape that. Like I said in the first episode though, there are ways to control it through use of zoning in before you place in additional roads around the side, so that can help a bit, but it's just a bit fiddly. Okay, let's talk about public transportation. And of course, trains is one of the first ones that you can unlock. You only need one development point to unlock it, in fact, from level 4. So it's really early on in the game, actually. Now, the one thing about trains, though, is that you do need to place in a really rather large rail yard before you can place in your station. So that's what we're doing here. And it's such a big asset that will flatten out your land around it that I really recommend terraforming a bit and making sure that you've got some flat land. This map is not flat at all. So that's why we've terraformed out this huge plateau in order to put this in. And what I'm doing is just running actually and redirecting the main intercity line through the main rail yard there, just so we don't have kind of loads of excess tracks, because there's an awful lot of tracks on the back of this asset to connect up into. And then we can go ahead and place in our main train station. Now the train stations are really nice assets. Like, they look super, super good. Well, I say it looks good because there is only one of them currently in the game. But it has 3 platforms. It's a big station for just a small town, so that is something to bear in mind, and you're going to need to and want to probably connect up all of those different lines. Now the train lines go in so much smoother than CS1. Like, the connections don't look ridiculous anymore. It is a massive, massive improvement here. So what I'm using with my station is I'm actually having one line that is essentially going to be the continuous intercity line that will essentially bypass the station. And then we'll have one platform that the intercity trains can stop on, and we'll come on to setting up those routes in a second. And then we're going to have another line which is diverting off into our eventual downtown, which is what you can see me doing here, is creating this bridge over the highway to run this rail line into that area. Now again, with all of the networks in Cities 2, it's just such a huge improvement. Like, being able to see the degrees of the slope that you're putting in just makes creating these bridges so much easier. And the landscaping tools with the slope function are just awesome. I know we had that in CS1, but it just feels so much easier and more fluid to use now that you can control the brush strength, really down to very minute, very small strengths, right up to very heavy, very strong strengths as well. And also, of course, the brush size. And that really adds for adding in some really lovely, smooth rail bridge connections. So you can see here as well, I'm now adding in the cargo rail terminal, which is again another massive building, but it looks super cool. Like, there's some great props on it. I just wish we had actual access to them, like all those containers. And you'll see here the rail lines again, they're just so smooth. Like, you can cross over rail lines without any trouble whatsoever. There's just no kind of odd jankiness that we had before. So I'm actually making some pretty funky looking interchanges that would have been horrendous in CS1. To get this big rail terminal and the cargo hub actually in and connected properly to the outside connections. So yeah, vast improvement. And then in terms of the lines, so if you do want intercity routes for both cargo and for passenger trains, you have to add them in yourselves. So it's very similar to CS1, it's just a case of adding a stop into your cargo station or your train station, then actually adding a stop at the intercity connection and then back again. And that will have your cargo and your passengers moving freely between cities. And then we're going to have a really brief little look at highway intersections. This is incredibly basic. I'm still getting to grips with all of the mechanics, but there's some super cool stuff that you can do with this. I think the first thing to notice is the kind of the filled-in bridge look that we get on much smaller elevations. You always get that retaining wall around the bridge, which looks so cool. Absolutely love that when you're working on bumpy terrain, like in this instance. And then with the highways, again, like, the road tools are just really fluid. I think the one kind of complaint that I do have about them is not having the road length function to them. So you can't kind of snap to road length in the same way that we could in CS1. It gives you a meters, but it's a bit too fluid. Like, what we want is really like cells, ultimately, like we had in CS1 when it came to precision engineering. So it makes it a little bit more tricky, I think, to get things in completely symmetrically, as you will see by my very poor example here. But the actual lane mathematics on the highways, oh wow, it's such an improvement. You'll see me here kind of playing around with it a bit, but it's much easier to upgrade the main highway road to an extra lane, so whether it be 3 or 4, or however many you're putting in, and then connect the slip road to that, and that gives you super duper smooth connections. It's an absolute dream to work with in comparison to how the highways worked in CS1. No more crazy, weird, very unsmooth highway slip lanes. So before I dive in and take a closer look at assets and the such like, I just want to say it is the start of winter here in Viewville, and this is what it looks like when it snows. The mountains are absolutely gorgeous. However, everything else is a little kind of I don't really know how to describe it. It looks frosty, which obviously, as you would expect, it is a nice dynamic. But before it actually starts snowing, it just kind of goes this really washed out grey in winter, and it feels pretty dreary to play it, honestly. I quite like the bright, hot, tropical temperatures. I do like the dark boreal vibe, so I suppose this gives us a little bit of that as well. But it's very grey and very washed out. And the other thing is with the snow as well, is at the moment, like, I'm hoping they're going to make improvements to this, but it doesn't sit on the assets. It's kind of odd. And yeah, you get this sort of income of slow where it settles on the ground high up in the mountain, then comes down. We've got a bit of a glitch over the mountain in the back there, which I'm sure will be patched up. But it's very grey indeed when it first starts to snow. And then when you get to full winter, full snow coverage, there's some interesting things that happen, like the forestry area. I'm not sure why that would be this kind of light blue colour. It looks very strange indeed. And then we got things like, if you notice on the streets, the cars are completely head to toe covered in snow, which is fine, but I don't understand why they put it on the cars and not on the assets. Then you've got things like the farm fields as well, which actually look pleasantly quite nice, very frosty indeed, but the blue of the forestry area really stands out to me, and it is pretty hard to play in this very stark white. It kind of almost gives you a bit of a blinding headache going from normal gameplay into this, I think. And at the moment, you cannot toggle off seasons, so I think there's a bit of work to be done on this, and I'm sure that Colossal Order will be working on it still after the game releases. But yeah, this is it at the moment. This is winter. And also just to note, there is no snow on the trees either. And the cars also drive around with their windshields completely covered in snow, which is interesting. I don't know how they're seeing anything out of that. So I'm going to spend the last 10 minutes of our very hard 30-minute restriction in this game just having a little look around the city, and you can see the walking porn happening here from the station over the bridge. It's quite satisfying. It is not as good as CS1 though, I really have to say that. The fact that the citizens walk more slowly is obviously more realistic, but it's definitely not as satisfying to watch because they don't scurry anymore, they just kind of gently plod along, as you can see from this. But yeah, that being said, there is a lot of Sims now coming over our bridge. So we are at a population of almost 14,000. We're making almost 100 grand an hour as well, so you can tell from that that money is definitely not a problem in this game and not hard to produce. But yeah, lots of citizens and actually lots of traffic as well. Now I do just want to focus on these mixed-use assets that we have here. So these are the mixed-use commercial and residential assets that we have in the European theme. And they're actually really quite delightful. I'm actually really enjoying this aesthetic. Particularly these little ones that we've got over here with the archways through, and they kind of go through into little courtyards with bins at the back. And yes, the textures are a little bit one-dimensional on the concrete at the moment, so I'm hoping we get some improvements for that, but these assets look pretty cool. Like, I really like this little mixed-use high street. I think that looks great. And it is satisfying seeing the Sims walking up and down, even if they're not so quick on the old feet. But I also just want to mention on the Sims as well, they change clothing depending on the season. So we're in winter still, well, bleak midwinter, as you can tell from the colours in the game, but they're all wearing winter clothing. Super satisfying. Now, I know a lot of people have been saying from screenshots they don't think traffic is a problem in this game. That's absolutely not true. When your city starts to get big, you absolutely do get traffic, and I've had quite a bit around this junction. So I added in this extra little slip road here, and I'm just going to demonstrate using some of the advanced road tools on this. So we now have no left turn, no straight on, no right turn. We can remove traffic lights, so I can right click here to remove the traffic light from here. I'm actually not going to do that because I think it's probably needed in this instance. But for this junction, what I do want is people coming off the highway here to only be turning right at this junction and to only be turning right from this side, so that people aren't crossing over the flow of traffic. And then we probably could remove the traffic light actually. So let's right click here and we'll remove that. So on this junction, what I am going to say is I'm going to say no straight on, because I don't want them going straight on, of course. And we are also going to say no left turn here. And we're going to do exactly the same thing on this side as well, so that they are only turning with the traffic flow and not across the traffic flow, which I think is pretty important here. But you can see here there is lots of traffic building up, so traffic is absolutely a thing in this game. You can still do all of your traffic management tips and tricks and all the rest of it. So yeah, it's still got that aspect to it, do not fear. I have added in some other interesting buildings that I do also want to go around. So this is the road maintenance depot, which is quite a nice little building, but you can see it sits a little bit awkwardly on slopes. And in terms of that, I've got a terrible example over here. This residential property. Yeah, I'll probably dezone this if I was actually trying to detail nicely, but the gardens and the hedges don't sit well at all on these slopes. So yeah, that still remains an issue for sure. We have also now got in our college that you can see over here, which is a really nice, marvellous asset. And actually, when you zoom in really closely, it is really nicely textured on the building. I think all the buildings are nicely textured. It's more the pavement and the grass that I'm not a big fan of. And the hedges are to be fixed, I am told as well, so that will come. But the buildings look really nice. Really, really nice indeed. I really like the college asset. We've also got in City Hall over here, and there are several expansions that we can put to that as well. You can see from City Hall, a lot of these buildings that you get within the welfare tab, so that's contained within our police tab over here. So we have got the welfare office and City Hall, which you can only plop in once. So it reduces your loan interest. I would not recommend getting loans. The interest on them is ridiculous, and as you can see from this, you do not need them. But it also reduces import costs, so it's actually quite a good thing to have in the city. It does have quite a high upkeep, but as you can tell, that doesn't really matter when you get to a city of this size. So the thing with buildings like this is really waiting until you've got a decent sized city before you actually place it. Like, don't go overboard on services really early on, because that will hurt the budget. So I have also added in a couple of the signature buildings. Now these come with different zones, so you do have access to European and North American within each game. So obviously to unlock the North American ones, I'd have to be zoning in North American buildings. But for the European, we've already unlocked some of those, because obviously my city is mostly European at this time. So this is one of the mixed use ones, which is the Epicurean Garden, a luxurious living space at the top of a high-end restaurant. So I think this sits in quite nicely in amongst things like the City Hall and the college and those kind of older European style buildings. Like, really, really like the look of this again. And some of my favourite elements to actually the signature buildings are the industrial ones. So over here we've got a dairy house, which is a really nice big industrial building. So you can see in the industrial tab there's some other much larger buildings that we will unlock as we get through different levels and zone more industry essentially in our city. Same with offices as well. We've actually got this one which we haven't placed yet. The signature buildings, they still act as industry, etc. So this is still functioning very much as an industrial building. I love it. I love the signature buildings. It's such an improvement from the unique buildings that we had in CS1. So there we have a city going through milestones 4 to 8, and just to kind of show you the wider perspective, this is how big it is now. So there's an awful lot of low density residential that has been demanded and has come in, obviously, and much less of the high density. I think when you're planning your cities, you really need to allow an awful lot of space for low density residential, because the demand is massive. Same with industrial as well. But that's the kind of flavour of the city at the moment. And if we do just finish off by taking a quick look at production, I've noticed we're up to 108,000 an hour. And we're at still a pretty small city realistically at this point. I still can't figure this out, honestly. So I've had one city that I did practice on before, which actually got pretty large, and it just had a huge deficit on grain. It was using nothing but grain, and livestock was in a massive abundance. We had a huge surplus. It's totally flipped around this side. So I think you need to use taxation to kind of control different products. So I have done that actually here. So if we go down to industrial, you'll notice industrial is now 4 to 14, because I lowered it quite substantially for petrochemicals to see if we could get some more petrochemical industry in. That is not happening. It's absolutely not happening. So we go down to our petrochemicals. We are making a bit, so there is a little bit of it, but it's not shifted substantially. We've still got an absolutely ginormous deficit. When I look at some of the industry, there's a ton of buildings using petrochemicals, but there's not very many buildings actually generating petrochemicals. And how you control this, I don't know. I've played with the taxes. It doesn't seem to have an effect. It kind of, honestly, in terms of the production chain, makes it feel a little bit redundant, because you just don't seem to have control over it unless you really are micromanaging and deleting every industry building that spawns in to control what you're getting, which is honestly not something I have patience for. Similar to the detailing in this game. Like you'll see over here, this park with all the bushes around the edge. This was not fun to do. We need prop line tool. Please, Colossal Order, give us prop line tool. So for today, that is going to be it, and we'll be back in another couple of weeks with the third round of this early access gameplay city build. Let me know in the comments if there's anything specific that you'd like to see from the next episode. Is there some public transit that you'd like to see that I haven't covered here? Obviously, we've only really looked at trains because of the 30-minute time limit. So let me know, what is it specifically that you'd really like to see in this final early access first look at Cities Skylines II? That's all from me for today, so if you have enjoyed the video, likes, comments and shares are really greatly appreciated. And thank you all so much for the support on the first in this series. That's all from me for now, so thank you so much for tuning in, and I will catch you again next time. Bye bye.